Welcome, everybody. Hi, I'm Ariel Zeitlin. I'm the programming librarian at the Montclair Public Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Open Mind, Open Book conversation series, which features top authors and thinkers on the important issues of our time. The series is generously sponsored by the Montclair Foundation, Investors Foundation, and the Montclair Public Library Foundation. There's an emergency exit just in the back, which we assume you won't have to use. And there are restrooms back through the corridor if necessary. And I'd like to take this moment to invite you to silence your cell phones. After the program, please consider visiting Watchung booksellers in the lobby. They'll be selling copies of Gail Collins' book for her to sign. We hope to see you again on April 19th for the next Open Book, Open Mind conversation, this time with New York Times editorial board member Jesse Wegman and Jim Johnson, the politician, attorney, and activist, who will be discussing Jesse's new book, Let the People Pick the President, the case for abolishing the Electoral College. Okay, I like that. And now I'm very happy to introduce Dave Jones, co-founder of the Open Book, Open Mind series and a former member of the board of directors for the Montclair Public Library Foundation, who plays such an important role in keeping this great series running at our library. Let's all welcome Dave Jones.
Thanks, Ariel. Good afternoon, everyone. As you all know, Gail Collins is a New York Times columnist who's known not only for her incisive commentary, but for her rapier wit. Gail was born in Cincinnati. She got her bachelor's degree in journalism from Marquette University. She earned a master's in political science from UMass at Amherst. And then she became a journalist in Connecticut. For several years, she set up her own news service in Hartford. She was a reporter for the UPI. She worked for the New York Daily News as a columnist for 6 years, and for 4 years as a reporter and writer at Newsday. The Times stole her away in 1995, and she became a member of the editorial board at that time, and then a columnist, and then served for 6 years as the editorial page editor of the New York Times, the first and I guess still only woman to have that position. She's also the author of 6 books plus this one. Also with her today and to have a conversation with her is Montclair's resident, Dale Russakoff. Dale was born in Birmingham, Alabama, went to Harvard. She was a reporter for the Montgomery Advertiser and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And she spent 28 years with the Washington Post as a reporter, covering politics, education, and social policy. And from 1994 to 2008, she worked in the Washington Post New York Times Bureau. She was here in 2015, the first year of Open Book, Open Mind, to appear as the author of the prize, Who's in Charge of America's Schools, which was a book about the fate of Mark Zuckerberg's $100 million gift to the Newark Public Schools. So you may remember that. We're delighted to have her back. Gail's book is No Stopping Us Now. It's a lively social history of American women and aging and illustrating the ways in which age is an arbitrary concept that has swung back and forth over the centuries. From Plymouth Rock, where a woman was considered marriageable if civil and under 50, to today's female presidential candidates. American attitudes towards age have proved to be a moving target. Gail gives women a reason to expect the best in their golden years. The review of the New York Times review of the book a few months ago described it as eye-opening, brimming with new information, and as you would expect from Collins, a lot of fun. So it's my pleasure to introduce Gail Collins and Dallas.
Gail, thank you so much for being here in
Thank you for
Montclair.
being here.
And thank you to everyone who came. You obviously drew a big crowd.
Thank you, guys.
Capacity audience. Dave made allusion to the first question I wanted to ask, but in this book, which is a very, sweeping review of women from the very first days of the settlement of America to today, I would like to know how you define older women and how that definition has evolved. Do you know it when you see it?
Thought, yeah, it's just out there, and I can tell everybody. It depends on the times, and it depends on a lot of different. The freakiest one I ran into during my wanderings around was at one point we were talking when we started working on the book. Its working title was "You're Not Getting Older, You're Getting Better." Remember, for that hair coloring thing, because it just sort of. And then we thought, "You're getting better" sounds like chemotherapy or something, so we're not going to do that. So, but while I looked actually at the ad. It's an old Loving Care, I think, hair coloring ad from the early 70s, and the actual copy of the ad says, "These days, if you're over 25, you're old." And I thought, wow, that was a tough time. Who knew? I think I was 25 then. Wow, I had no idea. So things come and go up and down. And I got interested in how you define women as being, what circumstances make them seem to be old or not old, especially vis-a-vis men, of the same age. And my bottom line came to be, except for scarcity, those early colonists, who wanted anybody under the age of 50. Truly, if you could have been in some of those towns and been 95 years old, and they would have been running after you. I mean, there were no women. When there are no women, there is no age issue whatsoever. But other than that, I just think that the biggest rule always is that women are regarded with respect as part of the community, as not old, not out of the way, not in any way retired, if they're contributing economically, some way, shape, or form. And that rule, if you use it in a very reasonable way, I mean, people who are active in the community, who are doing stuff in the community, people who are keeping this library going, are clearly creating economic wealth for the community just by having this great resource that you've got here. So I'm not talking about necessarily having a salary, but people who create some kind of a wealth, some kind of a added asset are not considered old. Nancy Pelosi is not considered old. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, God knows, is not considered old. And so that's kind of the way I came around to it.
Right. One of the stories that I was most interested in, that of many that Gail tells, is Martha Washington. I didn't know that she had been married before she was married to George, or that she had been quite an economic actor before she was married to him.
I'm so glad you brought Martha up. I had no idea when I started this book that I was going to get into Martha Washington, but I am now really into Martha Washington.
Next book.
No, I don't know if I can do a whole Martha, but still. She started out, she was a regular, normal, middle-class woman in Virginia. And when she was young, she fell in love with and married this much wealthier young man. The family was a little annoyed, in fact, but she won them over. They married, they had 2 kids, and then he died. And Martha took over his business and ran everything, and ran it very well, apparently, and really enjoyed it. But then she fell in love with George, and they got married. And George used her money to fix up Mount Vernon. I mean, all of his wealth was really her wealth. And they did not have any children, which George tried to suggest somehow was Martha's fault. But, I mean, obviously Martha had 2 children already, so, but it didn't, anyway, he was sensitive about the topic, we could say that. But, so anyway, there's Martha, and what's she doing? She is keeping house, in theory, for George. But when you are a person like George Washington living in Mount Vernon, every human being in the entire world who passes by is going to come and visit, because there aren't any hotels at this point in time. And she got about 300 visitors a year. And some of them would stay for months. And there's Martha running around, taking care of all this stuff. Everything is taken care of. And one of the most important things she had to do was to entertain these visitors after dinner with conversation in the library, because George would sneak off to his study and stick her with all these people every night. So she's having, and one of them wrote back, one man said, I spent the night talking with Mrs. Washington, and I was very enjoyable. If this happened again, I might believe that I could enjoy conversation with old women.
And she was 52.
She was 52 at the time. I think he was like 48 or something. There was not that, it was like 4 years difference in time. Anyway, she put up with all that. Then when the war came, she was at Valley Forge. She was a great supporter of the troops all the way. When George was elected president, we already have established that George does not know how to entertain. So she was very much involved in taking care of all the people who came as guests in the White House, took care of all of that. And then they both died, and the George Washington thing started, the great George Washington, father of our country, yada, yada. And who is the women that they celebrate alongside George Washington? It's George Washington's mother. Because George Washington's mother had George, but Martha and George did not have any children. And unless you were a mother, there was just no point whatsoever at that post-colonial period in talking about you. So it's all about George Washington's mother. And George Washington hated his mother. She was a very unpleasant woman, but that was the story. And it was just one way of seeing how after the colonial period, when women were farm wives, and they made all this stuff. I mean, they made everything. They made candles and cheese and whatever. Lots and lots and lots of wealth for the family is brought on by the colonial housewife. And they were very, very popular. Young women wanted to come and hang out with older women because they could teach them these things so that then they could do all this stuff when they got, and they were always popular. It was one memoir, a diary by a woman in Pennsylvania, a middle-aged woman. She was a widow, talking about all the stuff she did every day, exactly what you would imagine, thousands of candles, thousands of cheeses. And she discovered an iron mine. She sheltered runaway slaves. She was a very, very busy person. But anyway, her mother, who's 75, comes to live with her. And within the first year, her mother has spun 33,000 yards of yarn. So she's popular. I mean, all these people are very popular because they're seen in terms of the work they do. Then, once you move to the cities, once you're a middle-class housewife in the city, you have absolutely no role whatsoever except being a mother. And when your children are gone, you're consigned to the rocking chair. And that's when the George Washington's mother thing became such a very big deal, George Washington's mother. So I'm babbling away, I'm sorry.
No, but it's the whole thing of the mother or the older mother in the rocking chair is so interesting because then in the 1800s, later 1800s, you get into the story of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Yes.
Who had 6 or 7, was it 7 children?
Oh, yes, she just could not stop. You can see these letters from poor Susan B. Anthony saying, oh my God, Elizabeth, not another one. We have to go out and save the world. You're pregnant again. Oh no, but it went on for quite some time.
Susan B. Anthony didn't have children. She was just waiting and waiting.
She could not understand why Elizabeth kept doing this. It just was beyond her.
But it was interesting that an older woman who had done what a woman was supposed to do, had been a mother and a wife and done all those duties, then had a legitimacy as opposed to being stuck in the rocking chair. And why do you, first of all, I'd love for you to tell more about the story of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, because that was full of surprises.
It was.
But also just why do you think that rocking chair moved off stage?
Well, Elizabeth was big help on that front. She, at that time, before the Civil War, many, many women in the North, both black and white, were very, very concerned about abolition and slavery, and they'd read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was an issue that just spoke to them because it was so much about breaking up families and young women at the mercy of landowners and stuff. So people wanted to go out and work and do stuff, but the only thing they were really allowed to do was to weave doilies and sell them at fairs because you weren't supposed to speak in public. The idea of a woman standing up and speaking in public, like I am doing right now, was just considered immoral. Like you were flaunting your body, whatever that body may be. You are flaunting your body before men. You're being a harlot, basically. If you're standing up giving a speech, you are being a harlot, and people threw stones at you. And so nobody who was respectable, of course, did it. And all these women are sitting around, and they haven't figured out how they can work this out. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, absolutely, you've got to raise your children. That's our jobs. We are all mothers. Mothers, it's so important. And I have been raising all these children, and I'm so into this job. But now they're all grown. Look at my hair. My hair is very gray. Obviously, I am not a harlot. I have gray hair, so I'm going to get out and go and do things. And she took her gray hair, and she went all around the country. She would be on trains in the middle of the night. She would play chess and play cards with the soldiers that were traveling when she'd be in open wagons, 2 o'clock in the morning, jouncing on. She could do anything she wanted to do. And then she would get to these places where people were waiting to hear her. And she was usually, I think, billed as talking about our boys and our homes and our motherhood. And she would go on the homes and on the motherhood, and then sort of gradually wander into abolition and women's rights and then divorce reform. And by the end of the evening, and she had taken the whole thing down. But she did it everywhere, and other women saw this going on and thought, hey, this is cool. And that's when they started writing odes to menopause. Oh, menopause, we're free. We can go out and kick ass and save the world now. This is wonderful. So it was a good time for all.
Yeah, I was thinking like that chapter could have been called Liberation Begins at 50.
Yes.
Because it was, and there was, who was it that, I wrote this down because I thought this could have been the title of your book. Somebody called the older age for women, the shady side of 50.
Yes.
Who was that? That was so fun.
Yes, that was that?
I think it was Stanton. No. Anyway, but I thought too that that sort of fed into the era of the women's clubs, when women who had their children started doing kind of good works by coming together. And I was interested how liberal they were, like that all of these clubs started taking on causes like, child labor and social issues.
Well, some did.
But it seemed like a lot of the ones you mentioned, were there also clubs that were very right-wing as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole idea here is you've got these women and their children are gone, and they're sitting around the house. They've been to school, but they just have nothing whatsoever to do. So some women started finding little groups, and they were educational groups in which people were studying things like fashion in ancient Rome, and they would give reports about it, and then they would discuss it, and it was very intellectual and improving, and it was all very, very good. And they did this for quite a while, and naturally, some women got bored faster than others with this kind of stuff. And as they did, then they started talking about their neighborhoods and their communities and what's around here and what's this going on. And suddenly, and this is the time of Jane Addams and the first community-based, social services are happening, and suddenly they're out there doing things, and some of them really, I mean, you start out with these ladies from their homes working on learning more about the ancient Romans, and then suddenly they're out trying to reform the prisons, or taking in abandoned children and women, and civil rights, anything you could think of, they were doing it. And it was a non-economic way to improve the community, and they got the same rewards that women got who worked and brought money home to their families, because they were doing so much that was good. It was a sneaky, you often see in women's history sneaky ways of figuring out how to get exactly what you want as far as the outside world goes, without actually raising your hand and saying, I defy you, I defy you, I defy you, just sort of making it all happen.
And Jane Addams turns out to have lots of stories that I never knew. I just thought she was always regarded as a saint, but no less a person than the former president of Harvard said that it was, unseemly for her to, she addressed, in 1912, she had addressed the Progressive Party, and that it was unseemly for an unmarried woman to speak in public at a political convention. And then just not long after that, she won the Nobel Prize. So I didn't know how.
Showed him, I can tell you that. But yeah, there was that sense that if you were unmarried, you were really supposed to stay home and not do anything. But younger, seeing Jane Addams, seeing all these other people, and then a lot of young women didn't want to get married because they realized they could be like Jane Addams and run some kind of an incredible community program. And so lots of different things and changes happened.
Another person that I thought would be interesting to talk about was Margaret Chase Smith.
Your heroine.
My heroine, yes. I actually met her when I was 12. Should I say why? She lived in Skowhegan, Maine, and my father happened to have been born and raised in Skowhegan, and he was one of 7 children born to Russian immigrants. And Margaret Chase Smith was the congresswoman and senator, previously the wife of the congressman. He died, she won his seat. And she thought my grandfather was the American story, and she loved the family story and the family, and all of my aunts and uncles and my dad were friendly with her. And so when I grew up in Alabama, long story, and when I was 12, I went to Washington to visit a friend who had moved there, and we went to see the senators from Alabama, and then my father had said, why don't you go see Margaret Chase Smith? So we went to her office, and the secretary said, oh, she's not here, are you from Maine? And I said, no, but my father is. And she said, well, she's just so busy today. I'm afraid if you're not from Maine, she can't see you. Why don't you just write your name down? So I did. And then at the end of the day, I called, and the secretary said, oh, thank God you called. She was so upset that I had turned a Russakoff away. Can you come back? She said she would wait as long as it takes. So anyway, we were 12, and she was in her 60s, I guess. And she was so commanding and charismatic. And she asked us what we wanted to do when we grew up. We were 12, we didn't know. And she urged us to go into politics. She said, women need to go into politics. So I've never forgotten.
See?
I didn't, but maybe my granddaughter. So anyhow, I thought her story, as you told it, was so interesting because I remember that brief period when she, was running for president, and it was in 1964. She, as you might know, was very liberal Republican, and she was upset about Goldwater, running for president as a Republican. So she challenged him, and she was 66, and she was, all of the commentary was that she was too old to be president. And I thought, that's so funny today. She would be one of the younger candidates. If she
Right, you should be a baby. But she complained that whenever, maybe it was 67, I can't remember myself right now, I'm sure Maine people do, but that when she ran, she was out there, in California places, campaigning, and she said every single story about her started with 67-year-old woman is running for president. And then the LA Times wrote a story about this interview, and the headline of the story was 67-year-old woman complains about being called a 67-year-old woman. And it was just like, she could not get past it. But now, yeah, she'd be the baby of the field. God, it would be a whole different world.
And there was, who was it? It was a writer for the LA Times, a columnist, wrote that she was the most qualified person running. I mean, she was like really experienced on foreign affairs and on all kinds of domestic social issues. And I just have to find this line. It was amazing. Oh yes, the only problems are a matter of age and sex. And he said the best age to run for president is in your 40s and early 50s. But of course, for women, that's problematic because that's the period of menopause. And it would be
just go crazy.
For them to be going through menopause while they were president would just be a national security risk.
Yep. Not like anything we have now, God knows.
Yeah, they didn't, nothing about male menopause at the time. Anyway, I wanted to also, there was another, who was it? There was another woman that.
I have to say, by the way, about Margaret Chase Smith, that right now in Maine, there is a lot of discussion about whether Susan Collins is continuing to carry on the grand traditions of Margaret Chase Smith or not. So we'll see what happens there.
I think that's probably a no, right? Anyway, We were talking also about, women having, because women, I mean, we skipped this whole period that you wrote about in your last book about when everything changed, and that women in their later years now are serious, I mean, not always, and the problems are still many, but they can be very serious economic actors in communities and also in their families. They can have wealth. I was telling Gail when we talked about this, I'm working on a story about student debt and the number of grandparents who take on student debt today. And frequently, it's grandmothers, not grandfathers. And that is a reflection of what has, what you wrote about in your last book, when she wrote about the rise of women in the post-war period, and also post-recession period. So.
And if I could talk about economics, one little tiny more bit about that thing. When, to me, the entire story of what happened to women and why the life that women, when I was growing up, lived, which was all about basically preparing to be a wife and mother and then doing stuff and then being home, and all the other everything else was men's work. The time it changed came after World War II, when there was that huge boom in the economy, and suddenly American families really expected to be able to live middle-class lifestyles and own homes and maybe send their kids to college, to go on vacations and stuff like that. And everybody, maybe everyone didn't meet the dream, but everybody had the dream, and trillions of people in the country did get the dream. They did set up their houses, they did have their families, they were in the suburbs, it was all great. And then that recession happened in the 1970s. And suddenly, for the first time, average people could not support their family on one income. And that transformed the world. And I always remember my next thought about that, when I think about that anytime, is going to Connecticut to New Britain for some book that I had done. And for some reason, I wind up in a junior college in a class full of guys. But they're very nice, they're lovely, and I'm talking to them about women's history. And I said to them, what are you looking for in a wife? And they were much too polite to say somebody who's really beautiful. But they all said, oh, a good personality. And then somebody in the back said, and a good earner. And they all went, yes, a good earner is very important. So suddenly you've got a world in which young girls are going to school and they're thinking about who they might marry, but they're also thinking about what kind of job they will get, because they just envision their future as a time in which they, like their husbands, will be working and supporting their families. And that changed the world. That's the one sort of moment, evolutionary moment. Of course, the women stepped up and did it. So but that was the moment that everything was transformed, to me anyway.
I really wanted to talk to you about the presidential race.
Oh, goody.
But first of all, I think it's almost like conventional wisdom that the United States just will not elect a woman president. And I wonder what you think, what you think of that, and if you agree with it. Why, given all of the years of history you've written about the rise of women, why is that the case in this country and so few other countries?
It's interesting to me that when Barack Obama ran for president, I mean, he ran a stupendous campaign, you always remember it, but part of the momentum of the campaign was people feeling excited and proud about the idea that they were going to elect a black man as president of the United States. And even relatively conservative people very pleased with this moment. And I've never seen that with Hillary or with any woman, that exact same feeling of pride that we're doing something that really moves us forward. And I'm not quite sure why that is. But I do know that if you look at the people who are getting elected now for Congress, you're finding more and more and more young women going out there, making a stand. They're getting elected. They've got their own clubs and machines, and you would presume that they'll come up along and that they'll become stars and that they'll be the next sort of generation of people who are out there being considered. My only concern about that is if you look out, there's already a ton of women in some state legislatures all around the country, but there are only 9 women governors. So I often wonder if there's still a sense in this country that women are the ones who work well with others So you put them in this big place, but that the men are the ones who have to take control. We've got a ways to go in this project, I must say.
You know, we also talked between us about Elizabeth Warren and how, you know, when commentators talk about all the septuagenarians running for president, often they don't talk about her, that she's somehow in a different category from those old men. And I wonder why you think that is, or if you agree with that.
I do agree with that, and I think it's so ironic. After all of the time that women have gone through their lives being judged by age, she's the one person who's in her 70s who nobody mentions it at all. It's no big thing. I think it's partly because if you look at Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, and then you look at Elizabeth Warren, I mean, my God, they do not look like people from the same generation at all. And she is bounding around like a jackrabbit all day long and just filled with energy and stuff. And she just doesn't appear to be old, and you don't think about her as being old. But it does, you know, when people talk lately about who's going to be the vice presidential candidate if one of the people we see now out there get nominated, it's hard for me to imagine if Sanders or Biden or Bloomberg becomes the presidential nominee, that any of them is going to want a 71-year-old vice president. It just seems like a not good plan by anybody's standards. You'd want somebody, a younger woman, to have the job, but definitely a woman for sure. Kamala, people are talking about Kamala. People are talking about Stacey Abrams a lot.
Yeah,
I got a Stacey Abrams back there.
There was an article in the Times the other day about maybe, you know, there's a little bit of a groundswell for Michelle Obama, and I thought that was interesting. Like, you know, a wife
Michelle
of a president
Obama would
again.
rather be dragged over hot coals than run for president. God,
I think we can count on her to say no.
I think we can. Yes.
But I think that Nancy Pelosi is an interesting person for you to tell us, you know, your thoughts about, because she is 78, right? She certainly doesn't look it, but she is kind of that person who has done all the things that a woman is supposed to do, and now she's in politics and a leader in politics. You always see her with her grandchildren. The way Hillary was always talking about
Yes,
her grandchildren. I mean, how does she kind of fit into this mold or not?
Well, she sort of does fit in an amazing way. We are in a period now where if you are a woman who has succeeded in whatever you've done, there's no sense that in most places or times that necessarily you're going to be cut off at the knees once you get to be 65 or whatever. That is, what things that men can do as they're older, things women can do too. And I think it's an advantage for her being older, because it kind of puts her in a different category than all of these guys who are yelling and carrying on all day, and then, you know, kind of to keep people under control. And also, because she is really very old, I think people don't have the vision of, oh my God, we're going to have her for the next 20 years. We're never going to get another leader. I mean, they're presuming that she'll go away in another term or two. And that does give people more, you know, more sense of opportunity and hope and possibilities. But she is, you know, wicked firm when she needs to be. But she, you know, listens to these people. Her ability to keep all of those Democrats together in one place is absolutely extraordinary. I don't know how she does it, but she really is incredible. And she's just, God, with Mitch McConnell, I can't, I mean, yeah.
But she really is kind of a monument to older women in America,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And what has...
You don't see that much. The one place that is the worst place, I would say, for accepting sort of a vision, a more inclusive vision of older women being, you know, part of being everything that anybody else can be, is in entertainment. It's very, very hard. And whenever I say that, somebody says, Meryl Streep, Meryl Streep, Meryl Streep, Meryl Streep. And Meryl's pretty happy, I mean, I must say, and she's doing really, really well. And she told me that when she turned 40, she turned to her husband and says, it's all over, I'm done. Nobody's ever going to hire me again, you know. And then the next year she was shooting Rapids with Jack Nicholson or something, but she, you know, she hasn't stopped at all. And there are more roles now, certainly, many more roles for older women than there ever were before. But you still have not gotten to a point where, especially where younger actresses, as they grow older, are not really discriminated against, don't really start to lose parts when they hit their mid-30s, say, and it's everybody knows it. I mean, they talk about it all the time. But there you are.
Another woman in politics that raises some
Can I tell
older
one more
woman
story about that
questions.
exact thought? Just one.
Yes.
This always freaks me out. When in the 1920s, that was when movies were invented, you know, and it was a particular moment when you went from an ideal woman who was like Lillian Russell. You wanted some woman who's sort of very large because she's on stage and you have to see her from far away, so you want a lot of curves and largeness and stuff. She used to go and have eating contests with Diamond Jim Brady at Delmonico's restaurant. And when they went in, she would check her corset at the hat check room. I swear to you, I mean, she was just like that. But that was the vision of a beautiful woman. But then movies were invented, and you could suddenly see every little crinkle and suddenly the ideal woman got younger and younger and younger and younger. And the first Miss America, who was elected in 1920, was 16 years old. She was playing marbles in the auditorium between takes. I mean, she's just this kid here playing marbles, but she was the first Miss America. I'm sorry, I just had to mention that one bad part. Things have gotten better since then.
No, I actually wanted to ask another political woman question, and I wanted to tell us all the things that you think about when you hear Mike Pence call his wife mother.
Well, you know, it's all about Mike Pence. I mean, I don't know if there's any other person I can conceive of in politics who would be doing that. And, well, Mike Pence yelled at me today, I was very happy to say. He didn't mention me by name, though, but he said that an evil person at the New York Times had written a column suggesting that they should call this the Trump virus. And that was me. But,
No, but it strikes me because whenever he says that, I think of the early 1800s or something. It seems like, he's trying to put her back in the back of the stagecoach.
he has absolutely, he's not liberated in any way, shape, form, or manner. And that's what he ran on, and that's what Trump wanted, and that's what he's got. And now he's running our virus epidemic containment. So God knows what will happen next. It's just...
She'll probably be handing out
Mother will
digital
be handing
thermometers. I think that one thing that I would like to know, for those of you who've already read the book, there is so much detail and so many, thousands of stories about people in different periods of American history. How did you research this book? How long did it take you? Were you in archives for months at a time?
No, that's one of the differences of life. My first book I wrote in the 1980s. My husband and I wrote a book on the millennium before it came. But in the first books that I did, I remember going to the library all the time. And just, spending all my time looking for these books and looking for this stuff. And when one of the later books came out, it might have been when everything changed, I was in Washington, and somebody I knew in Washington, the state, gave me a party, and she said, I'm going to bring out some of my friends who are very interesting. I want you to meet them. And I said, hi, great. And they were all coming in. And she said, and this is my friend Jeff Bezos. And I said, you have transformed my life. I never have to leave my house again. I just order all these goddamn books and they all come in. He seemed very pleased. I think by now he's very bored with this topic, but that was long ago enough that he thought that was nice. But I had, it was about 5 years, I had a wonderful researcher who moved to France to become a food tour guide. All of my researchers do very interesting things. They're almost never have anything to do with writing a book, but I hope I didn't do that to them. But anyway, she continued to do all the research from France because you can do everything online now almost. And I think we counted up 1,700 emails in 1 year that she had sent me with stuff that we were doing, that she was sending me. So I had people like that who were helping out. So that was a great help, really.
But it just seems like almost every year of American history you have found 7 or 8 different people doing something.
Well, there is
kind
so
of
much out
reflective
there,
of the
there's a
times.
ton of stuff. And,
Right.
and I've written some other women's history books, and you run across these people, and you think you'd like to go back, and then when you go back, somebody else pops up, who's doing something else, and you think, holy cow, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, right. And I think since all of these people came, they're obviously as interested in you as they are in your book. So I wondered if you could tell us how you got started covering politics, because you're such a voice to everyone
It's,
on politics.
When I really got into it was when we moved, I got married when I was in graduate school at the University of Massachusetts, which is a place, this is not to the point at all, but my parents, when I was growing up, they had had their honeymoon in Boston. We grew up in Cincinnati, but my parents were always talking about how wonderful Boston was, and Boston, you have to go to Boston. I always thought, I want to move to Boston someday. So then I went to college in Milwaukee at Marquette, and I was applying to graduate schools, and I didn't really care. I mean, I just didn't have anything to do, so I thought, what the hell? So I was applying to graduate schools, and all I could think of was, I want to move to Boston. So I applied to the University of Massachusetts, and they accepted me. I had no idea it wasn't in Boston. And then I get on the bus to Amherst, which I thought was a suburb or something, and it goes on and on and on and on. So I was in Amherst for way longer than I thought I would be. And I got married there, and then when we graduated, Dan got a job at the New Haven Register, so we moved to Connecticut. And I couldn't find a job right away, so I decided I went around to all the little weeklies and the little dailies, and it breaks my heart to tell you how many little weeklies and dailies there were back then in Connecticut. And I told them I would cover their local legislators for like $10 a week or something stupid like that. And I got like 30 papers. And so I was up at the Capitol covering all these people. I had like 60, 70 of these people every day had been trained to come and report to me about what they had been doing. So they're just sort of lined up around the place. And I was writing every night, dozens of stories until the middle of the night. It completely broke down the barrier between talking and writing for me. I mean, the great blessing of my life is I can write as fast as I can talk. I can, it's, and I did that, and I loved the state legislature. I just had a wonderful time there. I made so many friends. There were so many weird things that happened. You did not understand how weird politics is until you actually hang out in the state legislature. That's one thing I learned from my book, too. Whenever, any period in history, I would get to a point that said, and then at one point, the state of Minnesota thought about banning the use of lipstick from women because it tricked men into marrying them when they were older than they seemed. And all those stories like that. And whenever the answer is to who the hell was doing that, it's always the state legislature. It's never the mayor. It's never the city council. It's always the state. So I did that for a while, and then I got a job at UPI. We were getting tired of Connecticut, so we moved to New York. My husband and I both went to UPI, and then I went to the Daily News. And it was when I was at the Daily News, and I was covering the city council, that I was writing so many depressing stories. But oh my God, and today, and they screwed it up again, and now that school's going to close, and it's awful, and it's horrible, and it's horrible. And I thought, oh my God, I don't want people to throw themselves out the window in the morning after they read this thing. So I tried to fool around about then with the idea of how to send them information in a way that would make them laugh a little bit, so they would feel cheerful when they heard about Donald Trump or whoever it was that was doing things. And so that's sort of and how I kind of got around. And then everything that I ever worked for went bankrupt. UPI went bankrupt, and then I went to the Daily News, and the Daily News then went on this horrible strike. And then I went to New York Newsday from there. And then at the time that the Times snapped me up from New York Newsday was telling everybody, we're going bankrupt. It's about a week now. About one more week we'll be here, and that's it. And mercifully, at that moment, Hal Raines, who was the editorial page editor, asked me if I'd like to cover local government for the editorial page, and I really wanted to do that. So, and I have to tell you one more story, and then I will stop completely about this. About the first woman editor thing. So about 5 years later or so, Hal was wanting to become the executive editor to the news side. He wanted to run the whole paper, and he had been planning this for a long time, and one of his plans had always been about diversity, and I knew that, of course, but Hal walks in one day and says, oh, I'm going, and Arthur and I would like you to be the editorial page editor. And I said, I can't do that. I've never been an editor. That's ridiculous. And I've only been here for a few years. This is completely insane. I can't really, I can't do that. And he looked at me and he said, how many more things you think you're going to have a chance to be the first woman at? I said, unless you're planning on being the baseball commissioner, this may be your only opportunity to be the first woman to do something. So, and I thought, yeah, you're right about that. So, and it worked out. It was great. I had a wonderful, wonderful time doing it.
I guess you didn't take part in the New York Times endorsement of 2 women.
No, we were not, they did not let the columnist in this year. I think they thought we were a distraction of some kind. Yeah, so
What did you think of that?
I thought it was really interesting, and it was written in such a really interesting and compelling way that I thought it, went a long way to move things along.
Obviously didn't have a lot of impact, though, did it?
Well, but no, who knows? By the time New York votes, God only knows what'll happen. We'll all, have viruses or something. But it's just. Can I say one more thing about careers and stuff?
Yeah.
Whenever people ask me about my career and how it went so well and so on and so forth, I always, if I ever have a chance, like to point out that what happened for me and a lot of women like me is that the generation of women before me filed suits and went to court and protested and complained and either embarrassed or shocked or horrified or enraged all the editors, so that suddenly there was a great desire on the part of many, many, many newspapers and magazines to have women all over the place in all kinds of different jobs. And those jobs, when they opened up, never went to the women who had been doing the complaining and the caring, because they were older by then. They were all thought of as travel writers or whatever. It was the people like me who walked in the door at exactly that moment who got all those jobs. And I know so many of those women from that past thing. And the one thing I want to tell you is that they are not bitter. They are not sitting around saying, why her? Why not me? They're so happy and they're so proud of what they did and what they've accomplished and how they've transformed my industry, every industry in the country, and that they don't ever get talked about enough because they never got the rewards, but they are the heroines of the story.
Well,
And that's to them.
and that's actually one of the pleasures of reading the book, is that you find out about a lot of women that you didn't know about who paved the way, not just as older women, but in different fields. And when we were talking, I just thought of something else when we were talking about Margaret Chase Smith. We had a sort of Margaret Chase Smith of our own here with Millicent Fenwick, who you also dealt with,
yes.
who was considered too old by Frank Lautenberg when he ultimately stayed to much.
97.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Also, I thought, can you, besides Margaret Chase Smith, are there any more contemporary Republican women who you think of as older women who've,
Did stuff.
Yeah, done stuff and kind of made some marks that we should focus on?
Well, a lot of them are now dead or long since retired, and it's so sad because the women in the House and the Senate used to be so proud of how they always got together and they always hung out, and they had their lunches in the Strom Thurmond room, which I always thought was strange, but still, they always had their lunches together once a week or once a month, and they played ball together, and they were just very tight, and they worked together on bipartisan stuff, and they still get together once in a while, but that's gone. It's that sense that you had before of people. And if you look at the number, and I'm sorry I don't have it on the top of my head, of the number of women in the House and Senate, it's growing by leaps and bounds, but it's all because of the Democrats. The Republican Party is doing nothing about bringing new exciting women or even new boring women into the field. They just are not getting into it. And the women who were always regarded as sort of the Republican heroines in the Senate, like Susan Collins and Lisa Mikulski, have had a tough time lately, and I don't know what's going to happen in Maine. It'll be very interesting to see how that goes and follow it along. It's a very interesting story.
But that is an interesting thing to think about, because you talked about all of these Democratic women who are coming in from the ground level of politics and being really welcomed and embraced, and there really is a much smaller field of Republicans. It makes you wonder the future of women in Republican politics.
Well, it's sort of tough in a way, too, because the Republican Party is so strained now, and the only real entryway, if you want to move up right now, is through this sort of the Tea Party, Trumpite kind of right wing, and that's never been the area that women specialized in the Republican Party. They were always so, sort of the moderate, reasonable people who wanted to make deals and work things out. And I don't know, some of the ones that are in there now, I don't know about at all. I must say, though, the other day I went and did an event in Fairfield, Connecticut, and while I was there, this woman, little old woman in a wheelchair, came wheeling up to me, and she said, "I am Eleanor Wilbur," and she was a state representative when I was covering Hartford, and she's now like 97 years old, literally, and she came out to see me. I couldn't believe it, but she was one of those people. She was always perfectly reasonable, and there would be arguments about stuff, and she was more conservative than the urban guys, but she could always make agreements. She could always find stuff that she could work on that could come to be a bill and to be passed, and it was just a different world. I can't tell you. They would have debates, and sometimes people would change their minds in the legislature. It was just, that's a different time. I'm sorry.
Right. I feel as if so many people came to hear you talk about current politics. So I wonder, should we start early with the questions so that we can really hear what Gail has to say?
Feel free. Do you want me to come down there? Is that the best? You sure?
That's okay. We look around, and I have the glorious task of picking the people who raise their hands. Can you hear me now? Okay, so if you're interested in asking Gail a question, raise your hand, and I'll try to include everybody. Don't all raise your hands at once. Okay.
I'm not as shy as some of the other people. Talk a little bit about the Weinstein case and the implications of it for women and for men, too.
Yeah, the Harvey Weinstein case is, and the whole Me Too movement is just so important looking at it all by itself. But the thing about it that struck me as it developed, and I thought more and more about it, is that this is the natural outgrowth of all the changes we've seen over the last generation or two. That suddenly, for the first time in the history of the world, our country, almost every place there's a workplace, there are both men and women in it, interacting on different levels, at different stages, and different careers. And it's clear that in the first generation of this, there's a lot of guys who did not get the message right away about how this was all going to work out. And Harvey Weinstein is just such a horrible, horrible person that you can't talk about him in terms of anything that normal people are doing. But I just think there's a lot of guys who did not understand the implications of working with women in the same place and how you were supposed to behave and how it would all work out or how it wouldn't work out. And I'm really pretty sure that right now, and Harvey Weinstein was a great more learning case about it. I believe that the newer people coming in, the men now, even the older men who are working in the offices around here now, know a hell of a lot more about how the world's going to have to act over the next generation or 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 in order for us to continue to run our economy and run our lives the way we need to. And it's just, there will always be bad people who do bad things, and but that it would be a pattern in the workplace is something that I just think, you can't have a functional workplace with this stuff, and you're not gonna. And Harvey Weinstein, who is one of the most awful person in the history of the world, just got the luck of being the person that we were all going to follow it through and figure it all out about. And he stands for it all. Unfortunately, he's so repugnant and he was so aggressive that you get a lot of extra lessons, and nobody wants to be the next Harvey Weinstein, no matter what you want to do. So it's been a great moment. And of course, the Times is one of the places that started it off.
I'm curious, you mentioned talking about Nancy Pelosi and motherhood, and I wonder if over history, if you think that her being a mother in some ways made it easier for people to accept her. You know, as Dale said, she sort of did all the things that a woman was supposed to do. Do we see this over history, that as long as women kind of check all the boxes and conform in a certain way to our expectations of what women are going to be, that they're allowed to speak out or allowed to do great, brave things?
It came away, if you look at just Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony didn't do any of that stuff. And she got always constantly assaulted as the spinster, the skinny spinster, yada, yada, yada. But she was out like Susan B. Anthony, and she would get up on pool tables in bar rooms to give speeches if she needed to. I mean, she was everywhere, and she just did it because she was going to do it. And I think was probably not as obsessed with appearances as most women were of that time. But she became the great, great failure as impossible heroine of the movement. So it's not, it's just not one kind of person that does this kind of stuff.
You know, just a thought, one thing when we were talking about this earlier, I thought of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who hasn't done any of those things, but is speaking out and is being heard. You know, in spite of a lot of people who wish she wouldn't. And I thought, you know, what do you think about her as the model of another kind of politician?
Yeah, well, she's not going to be the model of every female politician, for sure. But she's found a new thing. And I've been wondering, you know, Bernie Sanders is doing great with the Latina vote in particular in some of these states. And I've been wondering if a lot of that may have been, I haven't been able to find any stories that have quite made that connection yet, but I keep wondering if it's going to happen. And, you know, I mean, she was so new. It was all such a surprise even to her, I think, how fast everything happened. And she's made some mistakes along the way, but she is figuring it out so goddamn fast, what you do and how you do it. And she is just knocks them dead on the road. I mean, it just, people just, you know, fall apart. And if you want to get young people interested in politics, this is the person you want to send out on the town.
Well, maybe that's the answer to my question. So I was going back to 1984 with Geraldine Ferraro. And I remember our niece was born, and we saved the headlines because I said, Sarah, this is the moment. This is the breakthrough. Well, it's 30 plus years. And I guess my question is, what is it about politics, at least in corporate America? The expectations are out there, like you said about the Times. They needed diversity. They had to do this, and good for you, and I think that, you know, that's a great story. What happened in politics since 1984 to today when you have somebody like Elizabeth who can't break through the noise?
It's hard to tell how much of anything is about gender right at this very moment in this particular race, but it is certainly true that it's taking a really long time for people to become comfortable with all this stuff. Geraldine Ferraro got screwed up in a way by her husband. I mean, we hadn't like started to think about that stuff. By now, husbands get vetted pretty darn carefully before anybody goes anywhere. But back then, it was just like, you know.
Other women didn't catch on after her.
Well, no, we have never had another woman nominated for vice president since then. I suspect Sarah Palin. Oh my God, yes. Well, sorry.
I'm not sure that really counts.
Well, anyway, she was there. And we'll very possibly have a woman nominated for vice president this year by a person who's the president who's like 78 years old or something. So you know, just give it a couple of years. I don't want to say that in a negative way about people, but still, I mean, it's, you know, it's a big time.
Someone in the back?
Hi.
Hey.
I really am interested in the idea of like a culturally shared conception changing over time. And so I really like the stories from early America. And I was wondering if you, like, who came up in your research in terms of Black or Native women in early America, and how, like, race or ethnicity might have changed ideas of age also.
It's I just want to tell you two stories and then we can do anything else. And I'm sorry I haven't gotten to that before. But the early Americans, of course, when they came here, there were many of the tribes they were interacting with in which women ran the tribes. Women were the people who either elected the chief or the people who could veto the chief if they didn't like the person who got elected. And they were the ones also who were economically important because they grew all the stuff that got grown while the men went out and hunted. So there was a real power balance there. And what happened was that once everybody saw what was going on with the new white colonists, the men got different thoughts about what they should be doing. And of course, the tribes were also falling into all kinds of chaos once you got a whole bunch of white people pushing them off places. And nothing, that there was that one moment when you'd see people who would go out and see the Indians, and women would come back and say, look at the way they run things. We should think more about what our role is here. The wise older women, it was sort of always the one who did it. But that became tragically lost with so much of Native American culture at that time. As far as, if I could say one story about the civil rights movement that I just forget to tell sometimes. Of course, Rosa Parks was in her 40s when she refused to get off the bus. And then the Montgomery bus boycott started, which was the way most Americans were introduced to the civil rights movement in a really glorious, grand scale. And the people who organized the Montgomery bus boycott were the middle-aged women in those towns and cities. They were the ones who had spent all their lives, doing charity work, going to visit neighbors when they were sick, hanging out with other women and other groups while their men were at work doing whatever they were doing. The ministers made the call, but it was those middle-aged women who went out and did all the work that allowed the Montgomery bus boycott to happen. And the men were very, very reluctant to give them any credit because they felt strongly that it was their turn and that they didn't want people like their mothers getting in the way of it. I mean, Andrew Young said that, we've had enough mothers bossing us around. We'd like to take it ourselves now. But anyway, that nobody ever tells the story of the civil rights movement in terms of the extraordinary, extraordinary contribution of middle-aged black women and older black women. And I'm hoping that'll be a thing that we think more about in the future.
One realm that hasn't been touched on is the military. Large numbers of women have been graduating from the service academies, but it seems like the military is so steeped in testosterone poisoning that they haven't had a chance to rise to 3- and 4-star general officer rank. Is there any hope for women to overcome that?
Well, the first female Green Beret was appointed this week. I kept thinking, when I heard it, I kept thinking that song, remember, Fighting Soldiers from Fearless Men Who Jump and Die, men who mean just what they say, the brave men of the Green Beret. So now it's the brave people of the Green Beret. I guess I kind of like that a lot. I don't know that much about what's going on in the military right now, except that it, like everything else, is having to adapt partly because of the need for these women. I mean, it's not as if the military does not need all of the good, well-educated, smart, and healthy young people of both sexes who are prepared to go in and devote their lives to this kind of organization. And I can't believe that it won't just continue to grow, but there are many, many barriers, and I'm not probably the best person to tell you exactly what they all are. But if you know what they all are, please come by and see me. I'd love to hear. We're going to get you next time. I've got.
Looks like we called each other up for getting dressed. What you're reminding me of, my mother up there in heaven was a wonderful mother. She was a project manager. She had 4 projects. I was her youngest project. But her MO, her process, was what I think we seek in a lot of people today, which has to blend a bit of being a project manager, knowing all the details and how to get it done, and being a leader. How do we work that cross section? How does that happen for us?
Being a leader within.
A leader and someone who's a leader who is a project manager, someone who really knows how to get their hands around everything and do it. I mean, we seem to think like, what's her name, Ferraro,
Yeah.
had some of those trappings. Hillary tried to, I think, convey that kind of blend. Is that where we're supposed to go these days? Is that
You know that the next woman who comes along is going to be, we don't know what she'll be like. I've always felt that Hillary Clinton lost the election, even though she didn't really lose the election, because people just wanted a change. Even people who like Barack Obama, they've been 8 years and they just, if they weren't really happy with their lives, it's just, let's try something different. And for all of her many virtues, there is no way that Hillary Clinton represented something different at all. And I do really, truly think that that was the thing that kept her from winning the 12 more votes in 6 states that she would have needed to become president. And the whole way we run our elections. So don't forget to go and see Jesse Wegman's book, which is coming out now on the Electoral College. It's the next thing along the way. But I'm sorry, I probably didn't answer your question entirely. I became so obsessed with the Electoral College that I was just... It is a great challenge, but the thing is that now women have these problems because they're getting these challenges. And men have had these problems too most men who have gone to work have had trouble both moving up and doing the thing they're supposed to do. So have hope, have optimism.
You write about, I'm sorry, I have laryngitis.
Go ahead.
You write about unusual anecdotes about politicians. For example, Mitt Romney with a dog on the roof taking vacation. Where do you ferret this information out?
The Mitt Romney dog thing, which became sort of my thing for a while, when he first announced he was running for president, the Boston Globe, of course, he was the Massachusetts guy, the Boston Globe ran this endless story about him with his family talking about what Mitt was like and all this stuff. And one of his sons wanted to demonstrate how well organized Mitt was. So he told a story about how whenever they went on vacation, Mitt would designate ahead of time which rest stops would be the designated rest stops. And you could not stop at a non-designated rest stop no matter what. So they were prepared for all this. And as they're driving along with the dog on the roof of the car, he just mentions casually, Seamus the dog is on the roof of the car. Seamus apparently didn't like being on the highway going to Canada because she got diarrhea. And the kids then, it's coming down the window, and the kids are going, So Mitt pulls into a non-designated rest stop, jumps out, gets a hose, waters down the dog, waters down the car, jumps back in the car, and races on without allowing anyone else to touch their foot on the non-designated rest stop. And his son is telling this proudly as a way that he's so well organized. And all I could think of was he had the dog on the roof of the car? And so I wrote something about it, and I wrote something about it again. And then somebody asked him about it at a press conference. And if he had said at that moment, look, I had 3 young boys. Have you ever been in a car with 3 young boys? You know what it's like? Would you put an Irish setter in there with the 3 young boys? It was impossible. The dog would have had to be left alone at home or something. I would have had nothing to write about for the rest of my life. But what he said was, the dog liked fresh air. So I thought, oh, this is my thing. And so it was a very boring race, actually. So whenever I couldn't think of anything else to write about, I made this game up for myself where every time I mentioned Mitt Romney in a column, I would also stick in the dog on the roof of the car. So I just did it. And people kept sending me things. I've got like this thing, somebody from Texas, I think, sent me, some place that makes things that go on top of cars, I guess. And it's a plastic thing, and it looks like an Irish setter, and you're supposed to put it on the top of your car and then plug it into your lighter battery, and then it would light up while you drive down the highway. I've never done that part, but I've got the thing in my office. I will never let it go. It's really part of my life. That and the Donald Trump letter are my 2 best things in the office. I told you about you know the Donald Trump letter. This is when I was at New York Newsday, and that's when he was going bankrupt. Well, this was, good point. This was one of the times he was going bankrupt, and he came down before the city council, and he had this strange plan about something he wanted them to give him along the river so he could build something, and it was this weird deal. And so I wrote about it, and I made fun of him. And in the process, I referred to him as America's most famous thousandaire. And he didn't really like that at all. So the next day in the office, I get this thing, and I open it up, and it's a copy of the column. And my picture is circled, and it says something like, "Gail, you are a pig with the face of a dog. No wonder you are angry. I would be too." And he misspelled "two." So I framed it. I was going to throw it out. My husband said, "Oh my God, you've got to frame that." And thank God he did, because now, I mean, some collector offered me $10,000 for it. But my family says it's an heirloom that must be passed down to generations, so it's still around.
What do you see happening to New Jersey? The only recent recognition of the Me Too movement was a change in the congressional train to Washington, where they eliminated liquor, and apparently the membership was down on the trip. I think we're slow in this whole process.
There's got to be other things going on. I have some faith in New Jersey. New Jersey is one of those places, I have to say, it's more interesting state legislature-wise than Albany is. I mean, for some reason, it just seems bouncier and more stuff going on somehow. But it's got that same great taste of state legislaturism that I find so fascinating in the world.
Shift gears a little bit. The average state house can be a pretty toxic environment. What was it like for you as a young female reporter coming up in that environment?
It wasn't bad. There was a general sense that you kept your hands off the reporters, and it was just not a good plan to mess around with them at all. I remember one day, I'm about to say a bad word, I'm sorry, but something happened. I can't remember what it was, and I was sitting there, standing in the hallway, and there were all these state legislators from Torrington, Connecticut standing around me, and one was this guy named Ado Benetti, who was very conservative. And something happened, and I said, "Oh, fuck." And he said, "I can't believe you said that. You, a woman, said that. Oh my God in heaven, no one in Torrington would ever do that." Oh, and he was really very, very upset, you know. And I thought, wow, I've got to be careful what I say around here. I'll shock them. Who knew? But the one, and this is also not a serious story, but it was my favorite. We had, there were so many reporters in the state capitol at that time that there was no room for us in the state capitol press room. So they put us, me and Trish Hall, who became my partner and then became the op-ed editor at the Times. We all worked all that together. Trish and I and a couple of radio reporters were stuck up in the attic in this strange little place. And there's only one little tiny, tiny, tiny window right up at the top. And every year the fire department would come and explain to us that if a fire broke out, we should put a chair under the window, climb out the window, and hold on to a gargoyle on the roof until someone saved it. It was a place like that. But the only other thing up there besides the cafeteria was a thing called the, I can't remember the name of it now though, the Lay Club or the Hula Club or something like that. It had some Mediterranean name. And it was a place where the guy legislators, it was only for guys, could go and drink with the lobbyists. That was the real thing that was up there, except when kids came to the cafeteria. Nobody ever ate in the cafeteria except kids when they came on tours. And there was one bathroom up there, which was a men's room because of, the hula room, or what the Hawaii room was called. So Trish and I would be working until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and the next women's room was like on the 3rd floor or something, and it was all dark, and we're the only ones in the building. So we always used the men's room. And somebody saw us, and they put up a notice saying, "This is for men only." And wow, it was Eleanor Wilbur. I went to see Eleanor Wilbur, that woman that's now in a wheelchair, and I said, "Look, there are handicapped children who come up, going to the cafeteria. What if one of them has to go to the bathroom? You can't be making them run down. This is not fair." She said, "I will talk to them." She talked to them. They came back. They put up another sign saying, "This bathroom is for men and handicapped women only." At that point, I just took a picture of it. I mean, it was just my favorite.
More questions?
A slightly different topic. Many of us enjoy your columns, and especially your conversations with Bret Stephens. Can you talk about how that comes about and what the dialogue is before it actually gets into print?
It's really fun. I've done this with, this went on for a while. I think I've had 3 or 4 conservative guys that I have conversed with over the years, but Bret is by far the easiest to do. I mean, he's so funny, and he just, and he loves doing it. He's really, really a treat. So all we do is we email and we put up a document so we can put them in the document. But basically, we never see each other. And like we did it just today and yesterday. So it's all done now for next Tuesday. And there's an editor who looks at it after that. But it's just like writing to a friend, but in little tiny sentences. And whenever I go on the road, people are always telling me how much they love Bret. And, Bret loves to hear that. And I love working with him. He is really, really a pistol. And he hates Donald Trump more than I do. So we've had trouble arguing. But now that Bernie Sanders is around, we have more things to argue about.
Yeah, this week he said he would vote for Trump over Sanders.
I know, and I was so happy in a way because I can yell at him about this for the next 6 months. It's just going to go on forever, Yeah.
Given the toxic environment for journalists, do you have any hope that this is going to turn around with the vilification of the media that Trump has inspired to a degree which I've never seen in my lifetime? I actually am worried about our journalists. And is there anything you would advise people to do? Or you have any comments about this?
It's a very troubling situation in like 3 or 4 different ways, only one of which is Donald Trump. And the Donald Trump part is insane, and it's never going to change. He's going to blame us for everything, no matter what. He blamed us, I think, for the virus the other day. And he's just going to do that, and that's just all there is to it. And his people will do that. And I don't know if you've ever watched a Trump rally, but whenever he does one, he will immediately point to where the media sits in the media part and say, "There they are," and then everybody goes, "Boo, boo!" And they're turning on their. Oh no! I mean, really, it's really scary, kind of, the way that he just focuses on them like that. So there's that. The other 2 things about the media are, one, the dwindling amount of media there is. I mean, just if you wanted a crusade to think about, and God bless you guys that you've got your own local paper in this town. But besides that, every place there's no newspapers. People, they're going out all over the place. Most state legislatures are not getting covered anymore. When I sold my news service, somebody sent me, and then it died off after a while, but somebody sent me a picture of the desk that had the little banner on it that was still there. And then 5 years later, it was still there because nobody needed that desk. And now they've closed down the press room in the state capitol in Connecticut because there's just nobody covering the state capitol anymore. It's really, really, really bad and troubling. And if you want to think of a project to do, it's pretty clear that if we're going to have good local journalism in this country, it's going to have to be nonprofit to a great extent. Finding ways to support nonprofit journalism is just God's work on earth, I would say. And the other thing is the web, the whole thing of the web. You can't, people get more traction if they say something really shocking or nasty or mean, and from the right and left. I cannot tell you the great degree of really nasty stuff that comes over every day from both sides. It's just the way they get attention. And I don't know, we're going to have to deal with that. That's my other great crisis. If you can think about that and think about ways to tackle that, because there's got to be, over the long run, at least a recognition that this is terrible and that people who do it need to be shamed.
Can you talk a little bit about your hopes and fears for the 2020 election, and maybe also say something about Idaho's Butch Otter? Did I get that name right?
Yes, Butch Otter, yes. I just like to say his name. So I just, every once in a while, if I've got nothing else to do, and now Mitt Romney's out of my life, I would say, and then Governor Butch Otter is going to do this or that, just because it's such a good name. It's like Ted Yoho down in Florida, Representative Ted Yoho. It's just sort of cheers me up. I don't know. And I'm sorry, I've lost my question. What was the real question? The what? Oh, the election. Yeah, that's more serious than Ted Yoho, I have to admit. I fight about this with Brett every single day. I mean, I look at the Democratic candidates who are running, and every single one of them would be a perfectly adequate president, 10 times better than Donald Trump. And I'm only interested if they're finding some way to work this out so that somebody gets nominated who can win the election. And you know, it's if Bernie Sanders gets cut out at the convention, there's just going to be a lot of younger voters who are not going to want to vote. I just find it hard to imagine how that would work out. If it would be a big help right now for those people who are hoping that somebody other than Bernie Sanders becomes the nominee, if a few of the totally obviously hopeless at this point of time moderate candidates who are running decided to make a graceful bow out, that would be a very good plan, including some that have a lot of money. They could give their money to other people.
We have time for 2 more questions. Anybody want to raise their hand?
This is a very polite group. Everybody has a question, but they want to make sure that everybody else gets their turn.
Yes, I would like to know your take on the debates Tuesday. My observation was that I came away from it and discussed it with my wife and said, I'm amazed at how dismissive and misogynistic all those people on stage were acting, but weren't aware of it in some cases, because it started out with 2 moderators, both of whom are women. And they lost control because everybody here probably agrees, the women all agree, that men think that you can shout over women all the time. And they comported themselves in the most unenlightened fashion. And then when there was that break, out of nowhere came the cavalry, which consisted of male moderators and another woman, I believe, and all of a sudden it calmed down. It was like school children responding to male authority. And that's my take on it. I don't know how you saw it.
God bless you. I love that that was your take on it. That's so nice. I have to admit, I just thought, oh my God, you got to get control of this people, get some new people, whoever they may be.
But did you or did anybody here notice the shift? The minute the men came on, it all settled down. Not because men are wonderful, but we are preconditioned, as it were.
I think it was, I would guess, and I perfectly, the people who were doing it are, good journalists, but I mean, doing those things is very weird. And it takes, I think one of the things that happened with that one is that the moderators were not quite aware of how crazy it was sounding to the outside world. And the people who came in with that mandate, get this goddamn thing under control, and that allowed them to do it because that was what they were propelled in there to do. I think probably if you would switch people and the other women came in later, they could have done the same thing. They just weren't aware, and it's crazy that people are allowing this kind of yelling to go on. But you can see why. Poor Elizabeth Warren spent 2 debates getting about 3 seconds of time because she was politely standing there, and then this last time she was, yelling and carrying on like everybody else.
Two individuals were praised by the 2 original moderators because they acted like gentlemen. Interesting.
I'm hoping they'll get over that.
Okay, one more. So it has to be a burning desire. One more question.
See, now they're all afraid. You said burning desire, and that's too hard.
I'm not sure exactly whether this is a question or just something I'm trying to clarify for myself. because you talked about Harvey Weinstein, and I'm thinking about the connection between women's looks and women's power, and whether, in fact, as you get older, you become more powerful because you are seen less as a sex object. And that made me think about Eleanor Roosevelt and the fact that she was able, perhaps, to do so much ultimately because she never thought of herself as beautiful or was considered beautiful.
Eleanor Roosevelt had the greatest middle age of any woman in American history, I truly do believe. And that's, I mean, the whole looking, people and looks, and it's a problem for men too, but for women it's just 20 times more so. And there's just going to be a lot of adjustment. And the fact that of all the things I found most troubling when I was writing the book, I say it's just the explosion of serious major league cosmetic surgery that's going on now in this country that, you know, is kind of worrisome. But I don't want to end on a down note. It's oh, good, up note.
I have gotten so much, I don't even need that. I have gotten so much mileage from the line, I've seen better cabinets at IKEA than I care to tell you. And it's exciting to know, you know, with the craziness of my schedule, I always know when you're going to be written. When you're writing, you know, and I get it, you know, we set up so we will always get a chance to write. And I just want to thank you for your point of view on things.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here today.
So, thank you both of you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I agree. I look forward to her column. Do think about stopping in the lobby to buy Gail's book and have her sign it. Watch Hung Booksellers is out there selling them. And come back for the next Open Book, Open Mind on April 19th with Jesse Wegman on the Electoral College. Thank you.